Welcome. In this video, we are going to talk about entailment, consistency, inconsistency, logical validity, how to test for validity and invalidity, what a sound argument is or soundness, and how to deal with an argument. Let us begin. So first, entailment. Entailment is a relation between groups of statements. So suppose that X and Y are two groups of statements. And suppose that group of statements X entails group of statement Y. Well, this is going to be the case under the conditions that every single time or whenever X happens to be true, Y is going to be true as well. So in other words, group of statement X entails group of statements Y whenever it is impossible for Y to be false whenever X is true. So this is a very bit abstract, but so let's look at a few examples. So consider statement X here. X is Bob is an iPhone, and consider Y is an electronic device. We know that X entails Y. In other words, we know that Bob is an iPhone entails that Bob is an electronic device because under the conditions that it is true that Bob is an iPhone, what else has to be the case? Well, it has to be the case that Bob is an electronic device. In other words, it is impossible, it cannot be the case that Bob is an electronic device is false if Bob is an iPhone is true. That's what it means for X here to entail Y. But note that the entailment does not go the other way. In other words, Bob being an electronic device does not entail that Bob is an iPhone. So look at the following. Bob is an electronic device does not entail that Bob is an iPhone for the following reasons. Even if it is true that Bob is an electronic device, does it follow from that, or does that entail that Bob is an iPhone? Well, no. First off, we don't even know who Bob is. But let's assume that you take me at my word that Bob is an electronic device. Even if it is true that Bob is an electronic device, it could be the case that Bob is a microwave or a satellite or some other kind of electronic device. So while it is the case that here Bob being an iPhone entails that Bob is an electronic device, it is not the case that being an electronic device entails that Bob is an iPhone. So here we have an example in which the entailment relation between this group of statements and this only goes one way but doesn't go the other. Let's look at another example. Consider example 2. So now take X. X here is Bob is a triangle. Again, who is Bob? We don't know. All we know, or all we're given, is that Bob is a triangle. Well, if it is true that Bob is a triangle, then at the same time it has to be true that Bob is a shape with 3 angles. Now note here that the entailment also goes the other way. If it is true that Bob is a shape with 3 angles, then it has to be the case, it's also true, that Bob is a triangle. So here we have an example in which this statement here entails this statement here, and vice versa. Whereas in the previous example, while this statement here entailed this statement here did not entail this other one. So the takeaway from here is that entailment is a relationship that holds between groups of statements. It is a truth-preserving relation, such that if one statement X entails another statement Y, then what we know is that under the conditions that X is true, now, again, under the conditions, meaning we don't know whether X in fact is true, but if it were true, then Y would also have to be true as well. So what I want you to do is pause the video and tell me whether you think that there is entailment going from the left column to the right column, and whether you think there's entailment going from the right column to the left column, meaning. So look at this example. Here we know that there is no entailment from the left statement to the right statement. Even if it's true that Bob is an electronic device, it does not entail that Bob is an iPhone, but there is entailment going from this statement, Bob is an iPhone, to Bob is an electronic device. Pause the video and do the same for 2 through 5. Okay, welcome back. So let's go through these. So here we do have entailment going from the left to the right. If in fact Casper is a friendly ghost, then we know that Casper is a ghost. In other words, it cannot be the case that Casper is a friendly ghost, but Casper is not a ghost. However, there is no entailment going from right to left. In other words, if Casper is a ghost, it does not entail that Casper is a friendly ghost. It's possible that Casper could be a evil ghost of sorts. There is no entailment going from left to right or from right to left in number 3. So even if it is true that it's raining, it's not necessarily true that Bob's car is getting wet. For all we know, Bob's car could be under a garage, right? And then it'll protect it from the rain. And even if it is true that Bob's car is getting wet, it does not entail that it is raining. Perhaps Bob's car could be getting wet because it's going into a car wash on a very beautiful sunny California day. Here we do have entailment going both ways. If it is true that 2 plus 2 equals 4, then it also has to be true that 2 plus 2 equals 4. And if it's true that 2 plus 2 equals 4, then it has to be true that 2 plus 2 equals 4. So on number 4, we have entailment going both ways. Here we have entailment there's no entailment going from the left to the right. So just because it is cloudy, it does not entail that it is raining. But we have entailment going from right to left because if it is raining, then that means that it has to be cloudy. So that covers entailment. Now, let's move on to consistency or compatibility. We'll use these terms interchangeably. So what does it mean for statements to be consistent with each other? Well, a group of statements is going to be consistent with each other whenever it is possible for all of the statements to be true at the same time. In other words, statements are going to be compatible with each other, consistent with each other, if all of these statements can be true simultaneously. So take statements A, B, and C here. These statements are in fact consistent or compatible with each other because all of these can be true at the same time. Now, even if today isn't Friday, let's assume, I don't know when you're watching this video, but let's assume that today is Wednesday. Even if today is Wednesday, if we assume that today is Friday, then it would also be true that tomorrow would be Saturday, and it could also be true that Monday would be sunny. So all of these statements are compatible with each other because they can all be true at the same time. Even if they all turn out to be false right now, it could still be the case that they can in principle be true at the same time. Inconsistency or incompatibility. Well, a group of statements is going to be incompatible or inconsistent if it is impossible for all of the statements to be true at the same time. So consider statements A, B, and C. If we assume that today is Friday, it can't be the case that at the same time B is true. In other words, tomorrow is Monday, because we know that after Friday comes Saturday, right? So this group of statements here is incompatible because not all of them can be true at the same time. One of these will have to be false at some point, right? So what it means for statements to be incompatible is that not all the statements can be true simultaneously. So some of them are going to be true, but other ones aren't, right? So in order for statements to be compatible or consistent, they all have to be true at the same time, or should be able to be true at the same time. In order for statements to be incompatible, means that they can't all be true at the same time. Okay, moving on to validity. So an argument is going to be logically valid under the following conditions. So arguments are going to be logically valid whenever it is impossible for the conclusion to be false under the assumption that the premises of that argument are true. In other words, here what we see is a special case of entailment. Here's another way of thinking about validity. An argument is valid whenever the premises entail the conclusion. So if you go look at the definition of entailment, we know that a group of statements X entails a group of statements Y whenever it is impossible for Y to be false under the conditions that X is true. Similarly here, an argument is valid under the conditions that whenever the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true as well. So here we have argument 1 as valid because if it is true that all humans are mortal, and it's also true that Tom Brady is human, then it is impossible for the conclusion to be false. In other words, Tom Brady has to be a mortal. Argument 2, on the other hand, is invalid. Why? Because even if we assume that all humans are mortal, and we assume that Tom Brady is mortal, it is still possible for the conclusion to be false. In other words, it's possible that Tom Brady not be human. So we can think of a situation in which, say, Tom Brady is a dog. Under such a situation, we can still consistently maintain that premise 1 is true, that premise 2 is true, but it doesn't follow from that the conclusion has to be true because Tom Brady could turn out to be a dog. So in order for an argument to be valid, the conclusion of the argument has to be guaranteed without exception by the premises being true, and that is accomplished in argument 1. In order for an argument to be invalid, what that means is that the conclusion of the argument is not guaranteed by the premises. In other words, it's still possible that the conclusion could turn out to be false, and that's what we see in argument 2. Okay. So please take a few minutes to do this exercise. I want you to determine which of these arguments is valid and which of them is not valid based on what we have talked about before. So pause the video now. Okay, welcome back. If you determine that the first argument, argument A, is invalid or not valid, then you are correct. And if you determine that argument B is valid, then you are correct. Okay, so let's go through this. Why is argument A invalid or not valid? Well, let's think through this. Even if it is true that Riverside City College is part of the Riverside Community College District, and it is also true that Professor Guzman works for the Riverside Community College District, does it follow from that Professor Guzman works at Riverside City College? Well, no, because it could be the case that I could work at Norco College or at Moreno Valley College. So even if we assume that these are true, it still doesn't guarantee that the conclusion be true as well. Let's look at argument B. So if we assume that being in trouble means that black bears are dangerous, and we further find out that black bears are not dangerous, then that has to mean that we are not in trouble. Because what premise 1 is saying is that under the conditions that we are in trouble, that's going to mean that black bears are dangerous. But we also get the information that black bears are not dangerous, so it has to be the case that we are not in trouble. In other words, argument B is valid because the premises do entail the conclusion. Moving on to soundness. So an argument is going to be sound under the conditions that the argument is both valid and all of its premises are actually true. So let's go back and look at these two arguments. While this argument up here, A, is invalid, note that all of the information in the argument is in fact true. And note argument B. While B is valid, the information on premise 2 is false. So both of these arguments are defective in some sense, even though argument B is valid, and even though argument A has all true information. So what we want is arguments that are both valid and have all true information. Consider argument C. Argument C is a sound argument because not only is it valid, in other words, the premises guarantee the truth of the conclusion, but in addition to that, all of the information, all of the premises are in fact true. We're not just assuming that they are true, they are true. And this is what we want from an argument. You want to provide an argument that is sound, meaning it's both valid and the information is true. Why? Because every sound argument guarantees that the conclusion of the argument is going to in fact be true. Finally, when dealing with an argument, there are only 3 options at your disposal. 1, you can accept the conclusion, but you can't just reject the conclusion of an argument. If you come in contact with an argument whose conclusion you do not like or do not believe, you can't merely reject the conclusion. There are only 2 other options for you. You can show that the argument is invalid and that's why you don't accept the conclusion, or you can show that the argument has at least one false piece of information, one false premise, and that is why you don't agree with the conclusion. Merely rejecting the conclusion of an argument because you don't like it is not an option for us. So these are the only 3 options for us when dealing with an argument. Note that these 2 options, if you do either of these, you simultaneously show that the argument in question is not sound.